Women, y'all have it rough. I know that's a pretty blanket statement, but throughout history, it seems that women always take the brunt for the male world's mistakes, resulting in women being the victims of hasty, violent action. The Bible is no stranger to this. Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Mori, and today Group 1 will be presenting and introducing and explaining the womanist approach to Tamar, Gomer, the woman at the well, and the woman caught in adultery. I will be introducing the womanist approach and providing a pretty clear outlook so y'all can understand the rest of this video as we go on. So, what is the womanist approach? Well, the womanist approach is a biblical literary lens used to analyze the social dynamic of not only the power struggles between men and women in society, especially throughout the Bible, but we're also analyzing the socio-economic factors that play into a woman's role in society. So whenever we talk about feminism just really the counterpart. We're not talking about feminism, but womanism's parallel is feminism, and feminism basically analyzes the power struggle between men and women and does not take the socioeconomic factor. That is the differentiator between the feminist approach and the womanist approach. The womanist approach really focuses on those socioeconomic differences amongst women themselves. So an example would be the tale of Hagar. Hagar was a woman who was not from Israel, and she was sort of outcast by Sarah whenever she found out that Hagar had a kid that was Abraham's. And we get to see how those two women sort of fight amongst themselves, and Abraham is just sitting back. This is just a brief example. We will not be using this example throughout the rest of the paper, but it was just a pretty quick example to introduce a basic concept that is womanism. There are more complex structures, as you will see throughout this video, about womanism, but that's the general idea. We really want to focus on the socioeconomic differences between women and what that can do to divide them up and cause rifts in women, rather than just the power struggles between men and women like we see in feminism. We really get to see the conflicts from a whole new perspective whenever we look through a womanist lens. So yeah, thank you everyone. This has been an incredible journey. This is our final episode, and please enjoy, and I hope you all learned something from this as much as I have learned something from this in this class as well. So thank you and enjoy.
A common law in many ancient cultures was the law of levirate marriage. If a woman married and her husband died before having a son, the husband's family was obligated to give her another husband to have a son as their heir, because to die without one was a terrible curse. To keep the heir in the family, one of the man's brother would usually be chosen, but even the father-in-law could fill the role, according to some ancient documents. So when Tamar's husband Aaron, Judah's firstborn son, died, the family was obligated to help her have a child. The younger son, Onan, deliberately avoided getting her pregnant because the son would inherit Aaron's estate. But if she had died childless, Onan would get it. His greed infuriated God, and he died an early death. Judah also avoided giving Tamar his other son as a husband, possibly thinking that Tamar was unlucky after his first two sons died. By ignoring his obligation to her, he was committing a great sin against her by forcing her into childless widowhood because she couldn't marry anyone else. He also was endangering his own tribe, because if his last son died without an heir, they would be wiped out. Tamar was in a terrible situation, and in the moral understanding of the ancient writer, she found an honorable solution to her desperate needs. When she tricked Judah into fathering a child with her, she was choosing not to abandon the family of Judah, but to force Judah himself to her levirate husband, which would have been unacceptable at that time. If Tamar had given up instead, and Judah's clan didn't have an heir, the messianic line would have ended. But because of Tamar's chutzpah, she entered the line that would lead to the birth of the Messiah. She was considered a heroine for her daring ploy that answered her and as well as the tribe of Judah.
The story of Tamar closely resembles the life of a young girl growing up within an African household. In an African household, young girls are taught how to cook and clean from a very young age, with the idea ingrained in them that these future skills will be helpful in their life as a mother and a wife. Similarly to Tamar, these African girls are taught that their contribution to society is nothing more than being a wife and a mother. What is also shown in the story of Tamar is the double standards within an African household. Judah was ready to condemn and burn Tamar when he found out that she was pregnant, and Tamar was also referred to as immoral. However, it was seen as perfectly okay when Judah was having sex with who he thought was a prostitute. Similarly to an African household, men are held to very loose standards, the same loose standards that Judah was held to, whereas women are held to high standards that closely align to the thought that they will be nothing more than a wife and a mother.
Traditionally, the book of Hosea has been understood as a story about creator, covenant, and kingdom, painted in vivid and lurid terms in order to reveal the devastating and heart-wrenching reality of the situation in Israel at the time. The setting of the story of Hosea is during what has been called a dark and melancholic era of Israel's history, the period of the northern kingdom's decline and fall in the 8th century BC. The basic plot is that Yahweh, the creator of the universe and God of Israel, has called Israel to be his active agents in working out his plan to redeem and restore his creation project, thus saving all humanity from its enslavement to the dark powers of sin and death. Israel, however, is being completely unfaithful to their commission under the covenant, that solemn contract they made with the Creator at Sinai, swearing to worship and serve Him alone in His great rescue mission for the entire world. They are continually worshiping and serving other gods, the false gods of the surrounding nations, which only ever leads to disorder, destruction, and death. This covenant sworn at Sinai is frequently spoken of by the prophets in marital terms. In a famous passage in Jeremiah, Yahweh is recorded as promising through the prophet, "Behold, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers when I brought them out of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was their husband." It's in this light that we can see the true significance and tragedy of the story being told through that heart-wrenching but inspiring marriage between Gomer and Hosea. Gomer, a temple prostitute who worships and serves the gods of the nations which corrupt and destroy their loyal followers, stands in the place of the covenant community of Israel as the faithless wife. Hosea, as he continually seeks out and attempts to woo his promiscuous but still beloved wife back to himself, stands in the place of Israel's God, revealing his agony and heartbreak over his beloved bride, but also his patient, long-suffering, exclusive love and devotion to her in spite of her infidelity. Yahweh promises that in the end, after she fully and finally rejects him, he will finally win her love and restore the entire world, setting her in authority over the whole creation in all splendor and majesty. This is the traditional interpretation of the book of Hosea. God is faithful in spite of his people's continual faithlessness.
All right, guys. Okay, so Dr. Will Gaffney, an advocate of womanist interpretation, says the culture of violence, woman oppressing sexually repressed males who slander any woman who expresses her sexuality through what she calls promiscuous love by labeling her a whore and subjecting her to a public shame and abuse. She says the real feminine god of the universe is better depicted by Gomer, who will not be told what to do, but will have free and unbound sexual relations with any she chooses, regardless of the consequences. By nurturing her child, Gaffney says, it's, quote, in Gomer's mother love that the love of God, so often couched as mother love in the scriptures, but translated as mercy, pity, or compassion shines, end quote. Further, she says God's love is promiscuous. She just can't keep it to herself. She loves wildly and widely, freely and without fetters. It's as though God doesn't have any standards about who she loves. And so this interpretation raises some major questions about commitment and justice, and whether this God Dr. Gaffney presents is worthy of worship. And at the end of the day, we have to ask about any interpretation of the stories in the Bible. as with any other anthology of works, one, does it do justice to the author's original intent? And two, how does it fit in the overall story contained in the whole canon? Does it line up with the constant depiction of the creator and his purposes for the world as portrayed in the rest of the text? It's hard to see how Dr. Gaffney's portrayal of the story fits with the picture of an exclusively faithful God who continually pursues his unfaithful bride in an attempt to bless the whole world through his Israel, even in spite of her infidelity. Though this God of the Bible might understandably abandon his faithless wife, he never actually does leave her or betray his covenant partner by going off to empower other nations or peoples. This, however, is precisely what Dr. Gaffney says her God does. Gaffney says, quote, "She is not content with a single beloved people, church, denomination, or even religion," end quote. It seems very difficult to that conclusion from a book which has for so long been understood to be making the exact opposite point. So, does this interpretation do justice to the original intention of its authors or editors? Does it fit with the rest of the story? So in the end, as with any interpretation, this must be left to you, for you to decide.
So, moving on, we are now going to look at the story of the woman at the well, which is John chapter 4, verses 5 through 29. And it all kind of starts out when Jesus and his disciples are in Samaria. The disciples go to town to get some food, and Jesus is at a well, and he asks a Samaritan woman to get him some water, which the author makes a note to say that it is not in that time period for Jews and Samaritans to be associating with each other because they have, some differences. And also, she's a woman and Jesus is a man, so there's that too. And she is very off-put by it at first because of these differences. She is surprised that Jesus is talking to her. And she questions him and kind of looks skeptically at him, and he goes on to say, that he can provide living water for her so she wouldn't have to drink from the well again. And she's still a little confused because at this point she's still not aware that she's talking to Jesus, who is the Son of God. And then after he tells her a little bit about herself, she recognizes him as a prophet, and then is still kind of hesitant to put herself out there and associate with him because she's still kind of concerned about everything. But after their conversation, the disciples come back and they are surprised that Jesus is talking to a Samaritan woman, but they don't say anything, sort of saying that they, kind of trust what he's doing, different stuff like that. And then after they leave, the Samaritan woman goes out to tell other people about Jesus Christ, the Messiah. So without further ado, we will get into a little bit more of the sociological approach with Annie. Here we go.
When looking at John chapter 4 through a womanist perspective, it's really interesting because it starts off with her asking Jesus, a Jew, what are you doing talking to me, a Samaritan woman? That signifies that there is like a discord between Samaritans and Jews. And the Samaritans were people who were half Jew, half Gentile. And they had their own place of worship and their own sacred texts. And Jewish people were really concerned with being clean and holy at the time, and they considered Gentiles to be unclean and unholy. And so whenever the woman had asked, where's the true place of worship, she was asking the most controversial question of her time. And not only that, but when Jesus was interacting with the Samaritan woman who has half Gentile ancestry, she's considered to be especially unclean. And not to mention that Jewish men did not interact with women in public. They thought it was improper, and so especially for rabbis did not do that. And so for Jesus, who was considered to be a rabbi, to be talking to a Samaritan woman was defying all cultural taboos at the time. And furthermore, Jesus talked about her past. She had a reputation. She had many husbands and wasn't even living with her husband. She was living with another man. And the fact that he only mentioned it, not to be like, yeah, you whore, but was more of like, hey, this is who I am. I know this because I'm actually God. I'm the Messiah. He didn't even focus on her past. And also at that time, she was performing the gender roles of her day. She was going out water. to get water, and then for her to run back and start preaching in the streets that she saw the Messiah was changing gender roles on its head, because teaching and preaching at that time was considered a man's job. And so for her to go in doing a woman's job and then to leave the well doing a man's job, crazy.
So for my part of the video, I will be talking about John's chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. It's a relatively short story, but it still gets a pretty big message across. The story is called A Woman Caught in Adultery, and it shows truthfulness, righteousness, and meekness as characteristics of Jesus. So in the beginning, Jesus is teaching in the temple, and these people come along, and with them they're dragging a woman. They go to Jesus and they tell him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" Now, this question is a trick question due to the fact that if he says no, then he would be contradicting the law of Moses. And if he says yes, then at the time, Romans were in charge of Israel, and the Romans decreed that it was illegal to give capital punishment. So the people would have just told the Romans. Instead of answering the question that the people had asked Jesus, he chose to stoop down and start writing something in the dirt. This angered people. They had wanted to know how their teacher was going to respond to such an outrageous question. They kept bothering him and they kept badgering him until eventually he stood up and he said, "All right, let the one who had never sinned throw the first stone." This left people confused. They slowly started leaving one by one until the only people there were Jesus, the group he was teaching in the beginning, and the woman who was accused. He had looked at her and he had said, "Where are your accusers? Did even one of them condemn you?" And she told him no. And he answered with, "Go and sin no more."
So what does a woman caught in adultery have to do with womanism if we don't know that much about her? That's a validated question, but it really comes with looking at John 8, 1 through 11. In regards to the womanist approach, we come to see that scholars, theologians, and non-canonical texts have supported this idea that Mary Magdalene is the same woman caught in adultery. Furthermore, Mary Magdalene has been downplayed in her influence and just a bit of agency in the Bible, because she's considered also in theory to be Jesus' wife or a prostitute. I think this comes from a womanist approach, like understanding that religious leaders at the time may have understood this passage of its actual intention to include women in the ministry and in the work of sharing the gospel, but it wasn't something that they wanted to agree with, especially because if indeed this woman caught in adultery was Mary Magdalene, there wasn't too much of her past life before following Jesus that the religious leaders in the church at the time wanted to agree with and promote, specifically because Mary Magdalene was speculated to be of Jewish descent, even though she was more accustomed to the Gentile way of life, and she was a woman in general. So the womanist approach to John 8, 1 through 11 just specifically looks more at the misinterpretation of the text and or either the disillusionment that the interpreters and readers originally had at the time of this text, but it's also just a way of realigning our mind's perception of what Christ's ministry is about and who it includes.
So throughout this video, we've explored the perspective of womanism as it relates to biblical passages. And just to reiterate what womanism is, it's an expansion of feminism that includes the latter's awareness of traditional sexual roles between men and women, but also considers the special concerns that race and ethnicity present to women of color. And so when we look in Genesis 38 at the story of Tamar, we're introduced to how society expects something of her, and because of the gender roles of that day, like, it was really hard for her to have kids and stuff. And then in John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery was caught in the act, and then Jesus stopped them from stoning her. And then in John chapter 4, the woman at the well who had a bad reputation in town, but not only a bad reputation, but in her interaction with Jesus was between a Jew and Samaritan, and that was kind of crazy during that day. And then in Hosea, the prostitute Gomer kept getting bought back by Hosea. And so when you read the Bible through this perspective, it challenges the reader in a new way and adds dynamic to what it means to be a woman in biblical times.